Dean gripped the ferry railing, the salt spray stinging his face. He welcomed the discomfort. It was a distraction, however minor, from the hollow ache that had taken root deep in his chest. Grief was a constant companion these days. He stared at the island looming ahead, a jagged silhouette against the bruised sky. The island, his grandfather's legacy. A place Dean hadn't even known existed until the lawyer's crisp, impersonal letter arrived. A lighthouse keeper's cottage, perched on a spit of land that looked barely habitable. Perfect. Utterly, beautifully isolated. The ferry groaned as it bumped against the weathered dock. Only a handful of people disembarked, mostly taciturn locals who eyed him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. He lugged his duffel bag and a heavy box of maps onto the uneven planks, the wood creaking under the weight. The air was thick with the smell of brine and something else, something earthy and damp, like decaying seaweed. A thick fog clung to the island, muting the already bleak landscape. He found the path leading away from the dock, a narrow track overgrown with tough, wiry grass. The cottage was further than he'd anticipated. The path wound its way along the rocky coastline, past gnarled, wind-battered trees that clawed at the sky. The fog swirled around him, blurring the edges of the world, making him feel utterly alone. Finally, he saw it. The cottage. It was smaller than he'd imagined, a squat stone building with a slate roof that sagged in places. The windows were dark, like vacant eyes staring out at the sea. A wave of apprehension washed over him, a feeling he quickly dismissed. He was being ridiculous. It was just an old house. He pushed open the creaking wooden door, the hinges protesting with a rusty groan. Dust motes danced in the faint light filtering through the grimy windows. The main room was sparsely furnished. A rickety table, a couple of chairs, and a sagging couch covered in a faded floral-patterned fabric. A narrow staircase led to the upper floor. He dropped his bag with a thud and ran a hand over the rough stone of the fireplace. It would need a good cleaning before he could even think about lighting a fire. Upstairs, he found two small bedrooms. One contained a narrow bed with a lumpy mattress. The other was empty, save for a built-in wardrobe and a scattering of dust. He chose the bedroom with the bed, drawn to the idea of some semblance of comfort, however meager. He spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking, trying to impose some order on the chaos. He hung his few clothes in the wardrobe, stacked his maps on the table, and made the bed with the threadbare sheets he found in a drawer. As dusk began to settle, the fog outside thickened, pressing against the windows like a suffocating blanket. He made himself a meager dinner of canned soup and stale bread, eating it at the rickety table. The silence was starting to get to him. He longed for the familiar sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the chatter of voices. After dinner, he decided to explore the island. He pulled on his jacket and stepped back out into the fog. The beam of his flashlight cut through the swirling mist, revealing only a few feet of the path ahead. He walked for what felt like hours, the only sound his own footsteps and the ceaseless roar of the ocean. He came across a small, dilapidated structure. A sign above the door, barely legible, read, "Weather Station." The windows were boarded up, the paint peeling. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. He shined his flashlight on the door, trying to peer inside through the cracks in the boards. He could make out the faint outlines of equipment covered in dust and cobwebs. A strange feeling washed over him, a sense of unease that he couldn't quite explain. He turned away from the weather station, quickening his pace. The fog seemed to be closing in, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He stopped, listening intently. There it was again, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to come from the sea itself. He dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on his ears, but the feeling of unease persisted. He reached the cottage, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He slammed the door shut behind him, bolting it securely. He leaned against the door, his body trembling. He was being ridiculous, he told himself. It was just the fog, the isolation, the grief. It was getting to him. But as he stood there, listening to the wind howling outside, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that something was out there, watching him, waiting, and that whatever it was coming for him. He welcomed the discomfort. Grief was a constant companion these days. The island looked hungry. The cottage was exactly as he remembered from blurry childhood photos. Weathered gray stone clinging to the windswept cliffs. It felt smaller, more vulnerable than he'd imagined. The lighthouse itself, a skeletal finger pointing accusingly at the heavens, dominated the landscape. Dean hauled his meager belongings inside, the air thick with the smell of brine and dust. He found a can of beans and ate them cold, standing by the window, watching the relentless waves crash against the shore. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by the mournful groan of the wind and the rhythmic pulse of the lighthouse beam. He dreamt of her, her laughter, the way the sun caught in her hair. Then the laughter twisted, became a gurgling sob, her hair dissolving into seaweed. He woke with a gasp, the taste of salt heavy on his tongue. The next morning, Dean decided to explore. He needed to occupy his mind, find some semblance of normalcy in this desolate place. He followed a winding path that led him away from the cottage, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying seaweed. The path climbed steadily, offering panoramic views of the churning ocean. He passed the rusted-out remains of what looked like an old winch system, its purpose now lost to time. Further on, perched precariously on the highest point of the island, stood the weather station. Dean approached cautiously. The weather station was a small, square building constructed of the same gray stone as the cottage, but in far worse repair. Windows were boarded up, the door hanging crookedly on one hinge. A faded sign above the entrance read, "Keep out." Of course, he went inside. The interior was a disaster. Instruments lay scattered and broken. Wires dangled from the ceiling like macabre decorations. Dust lay thick on every surface, disturbed only by the scuttling of unseen creatures. A thick layer of mildew coated the walls, and the air hung heavy with the smell of decay. Dean coughed, pulling his scarf higher over his nose. He sifted through the debris, his fingers brushing against shattered glass and corroded metal. The last entry was dated nearly 50 years ago. Tides are unnatural, rising higher than predicted. The sea, it feels different, angry. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. Dean flipped through the remaining pages. They were filled with similar observations, growing increasingly erratic. The last few entries were nothing more than a series of repeated phrases. The deep song, it calls, it hungers. Dean shivered, despite the stuffy air. He slammed the logbook shut, a cloud of dust erupting around him. Back at the cottage, he found his grandfather's trunk. It was locked, but a rusty crowbar from the shed quickly remedied that. Inside, beneath layers of moth-eaten clothes, was a journal. Water damaged, its pages warped and stained, the ink blurred in places. The first few pages were filled with mundane entries about weather patterns and supply shipments. But as he flipped further, the entries became strange. Sketches of grotesque, vaguely aquatic creatures filled the margins. Tentacles, gaping maws, eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. Alongside the sketches were warnings, scrawled in a frantic hand. Beware the deep song, but it only seeks to consume. He was a cartographer, a man of logic and reason. There had to be a rational explanation for all of this. Maybe his grandfather had been eccentric. Maybe the isolation had gotten to him. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. He could almost hear a faint, unsettling melody carried on the wind. Later, as he tried to sleep, Dean couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Then he heard it, A faint, rhythmic pulse. Not the rhythmic pulse of the lighthouse. This was deeper, slower. It vibrated through the floorboards, resonating in his bones. It sounded like a heartbeat coming from beneath the waves. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block it out. Dean ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. Maybe his grandfather had been eccentric. Maybe the isolation had gotten to him. He tried to convince himself, but the unease gnawing at him remained. He needed answers. He remembered the old fisherman at the docks, the one with eyes that seemed to have seen too much. Maybe he knew something about the island's history, about his grandfather, about the unsettling feeling that clung to the air like the perpetual fog. The next morning, Dean resolved to visit the small village on the other side of the island. He packed a meager lunch, grabbed his grandfather's old oilskins, and set out along the overgrown coastal path. The air was thick with the briny scent of the sea and the earthy smell of decaying seaweed. The fog hung heavy, muffling every sound, turning the familiar landscape into a ghostly maze. The village was little more than a cluster of weathered cottages huddled around a small harbor. Fishing boats bobbed gently in the water, their hulls creaking in protest. Dean found the fishermen mending nets near the docks. "Excuse me?" Dean began, his voice raspy from disuse. "I'm Dean, Thomas's grandson. I'm staying at the lighthouse." The fisherman looked up, his gaze piercing. He nodded slowly. I knew Thomas. A strange one, he was, kept to himself. "I was hoping you could tell me something about the island," Dean said, "about its history." The fisherman hesitated, his eyes scanning the horizon. "There are stories," he said finally, his voice low. "Old stories, of a city swallowed by the sea, of ancient rites and things best left undisturbed." "What kind of rites?" Dean pressed, a knot forming in his stomach. "Sacrifices," the fisherman whispered, "to appease the old gods of the deep. They say they still sleep beneath the waves, waiting to be awakened." Dean felt a chill run down his spine, despite the heavy oilskins. "Do you believe these stories?" The fisherman shrugged. "I believe in respecting the sea. It gives and it takes. And sometimes," he added, his voice barely audible, "it demands a price." Dean thanked him and walked away, his mind reeling. Sunken cities? Ancient gods? But the fisherman's words had struck a chord, resonating with the unsettling feeling that had taken root in his soul. Back at the cottage, Dean decided to focus on something tangible. He pulled out his grandfather's journals again, determined to decipher the cryptic entries. The more he read, the clearer they became. They spoke of a pact, a bargain struck with something ancient and powerful. A bargain that required appeasement. That night, Dean's dreams were more vivid, more disturbing than ever before. He saw himself walking through the ruins of a submerged city, its buildings overgrown with strange, pulsating vegetation. The cottage was silent, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He got out of bed and walked to the window. The fog was even thicker than usual, swirling around the lighthouse like a living entity. As he stared out into the swirling mist, he noticed something strange. A faint, ethereal glow emanating from the rocks near the shore. He grabbed a lantern and ventured outside, drawn to the light like a moth to a flame. Bioluminescent algae, glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. It was growing in patches on the rocks, spreading like a creeping vine. It pulsed with a faint rhythmic beat, as if it were alive. He'd never seen anything like it before. The next day, Dean knew he had to find the weather station. Maybe there were old records, something that could shed light on the island's history. The hike was arduous, the path overgrown and treacherous. The fog clung to him like a shroud, making it difficult to see. But Dean pressed on, driven by a desperate need for answers. He found the weather station perched precariously on the edge of a cliff. The building was dilapidated, its windows boarded up, its roof partially collapsed. But inside, he found what he was looking for. Old logbooks, filled with weather observations and other miscellaneous notes. He spent hours poring over the faded entries, searching for any mention of strange phenomena, of unusual activity on the island. He found nothing at first, just routine weather reports. The entries spoke of strange lights in the sky, of tremors beneath the ground, of a growing sense of unease among the island's inhabitants. They spoke of sacrifices, of appeasing the old gods. And then, the entries stopped abruptly. Dean closed the logbook, his hands trembling. The pieces were starting to fall into place, forming a disturbing picture. The sunken city, the ancient rites, the pact, the bioluminescent algae, the unsettling feeling that permeated the island. It was all connected. He was no longer dealing with folklore. He was dealing with something real, something ancient, something malevolent. And he was beginning to suspect that his grandfather had been more than just an eccentric lighthouse keeper. He had been a guardian, a protector, holding back something terrible from the depths. And now, Dean was here, alone. And whatever it was waking up. Sunken cities? Ancient gods? It all sounded like folklore, the product of isolated minds and long, dark winters. Back at the cottage, the air felt heavier, expectant. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Earthy. Like wet soil dredged from a forgotten grave. It clung to the back of his throat, a constant, subtle reminder that he wasn't alone. He told himself it was the old wood, the dampness, the lack of proper ventilation. He opened windows, letting the salty wind whip through the rooms. But the smell lingered, stubbornly refusing to dissipate. Then came the sounds. At first, Dean dismissed them as the house settling, the groan of timbers under the relentless assault of the wind. But soon, he couldn't ignore the subtle creaks and whispers that seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves. A rhythmic hum, so low he felt it more than heard it, vibrated through the floorboards, up his legs, settling in his chest like a lead weight. A book fell from the shelf in the middle of the night. A chair scraped against the floorboards when he was certain he was the only one awake. Small things, easily explained away, but each incident ratcheted up the tension, tightening the knot of unease in his stomach. One morning, Dean stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror above the wash basin. Or rather, he stared at what was almost his reflection. The eyes were wrong, too deep-set, too knowing. And the mouth seemed to curve in a subtle, unsettling smile that Dean knew he hadn't made. He pulled out dusty journals, their pages filled with cryptic entries, sketches of strange symbols, and increasingly frantic pleas for something to be appeased. One entry, scrawled in shaky handwriting, sent a shiver down his spine. The tides rise, and with them, its hunger. The offering must be made. It is the only way to keep it at bay. Offering? Dean rummaged through the attic, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. Inside, nestled in a faded velvet box, lay a collection of strange artifacts, a tarnished silver amulet etched with the same unsettling symbols from the journal, a handful of smooth black stones that felt strangely warm to the touch, a small, intricately carved wooden idol depicting a grotesque, vaguely humanoid figure with tentacles sprouting from its face. He recoiled, dropping the idol as if it had burned him. The fisherman's words echoed in his mind. Ancient gods, sacrifices. The hum intensified, vibrating through the cottage, rattling the windows in their frames. He decided to head to the weather station. It was the only other building on the island, and perhaps he could find some records, some clue as to what was going on. The walk was a blur. The wind howled, whipping his hair across his face, and the fog swirled around him, thick and disorienting. As he neared the weather station, he saw something out of the corner of his eye. a fleeting glimpse of movement in the water. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The water was unusually still, almost glassy, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. And then he saw it again. A tendril, thick and black, rose from the depths, breaking the surface with a wet, sucking sound. It writhed in the air for a moment, glistening in the faint light, before disappearing back into the water. Dean didn't wait to see more. He turned and ran, his lungs burning, his mind screaming. He burst through the door of the weather station, slamming it shut behind him. The small, cramped space offered little comfort. The air was stale and musty, filled with the metallic tang of old machinery. He leaned against the door, gasping for breath, his eyes darting around the room. He was not alone. It was vaguely humanoid, but its features were blurred, indistinct, as if seen through a veil of water. 2 points of crimson light burned within its depths, fixing on him with an unnerving intensity. Dean stood frozen, paralyzed by fear. The hum intensified, resonating in his skull, threatening to shatter his sanity. The entity reached out a shimmering, translucent hand towards him, and Dean knew, with a sickening certainty, that his grandfather's solitude had become his prison. Dean stumbled back from the window, the relentless hum burrowing into his skull. The cottage seemed to vibrate around him, a fragile shell about to shatter. He couldn't stay here, not now. Not while that sound clawed at the edges of his sanity. He needed answers, and the journal held the key. He grabbed it from the table, its brittle pages cool against his trembling fingers. The weather station. Grandfather had mentioned it repeatedly, cryptic notes about readings and calibrations, but now Dean suspected there was more to it than just meteorology. The fog outside was thicker than ever, a suffocating blanket that muted the already bleak landscape. Each step away from the cottage felt like a victory, a small act of defiance against the growing dread that threatened to consume him. The air tasted of salt and something else, something ancient and vaguely rotten. The weather station was a squat, concrete structure about half a mile from the cottage. Usually, he could see its dull silhouette from his window, but today, the fog swallowed it whole. Dean pressed on, the journal clutched tightly in his hand, using the faint beam of his flashlight to cut through the oppressive gloom. The door to the weather station creaked open with a protesting groan, the hinges rusted and worn. He found a small, relatively clean corner and set down the journal. The hum was fainter here, almost bearable. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the familiar script, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. The entries became more frantic in the weeks leading up to his grandfather's death. More talk of the deep song, of maintaining the equilibrium. One passage, scrawled in shaky handwriting, sent a shiver down Dean's spine. The ritual must be maintained. The tides are restless. It hungers. Ritual? What ritual? His grandfather, a man of science, involved in some kind of ceremony? It was absurd, yet the mounting evidence pointed to something far beyond rational explanation. He read further, deciphering cryptic references to specific dates and times, coordinates, and detailed instructions involving chanting and offerings. Offerings to what? The entity in the water? The deep song, whatever that was, seemed to be connected to the ritual, a kind of sonic key. As he read, the hum intensified again, resonating within the concrete walls of the weather station. It was no longer just a sound. It was a vibration that seemed to penetrate his very bones. He felt a growing pressure in his head, a blurring of his vision. The words on the page seemed to shift and writhe, taking on new and disturbing meanings. He blinked, trying to clear his head. He spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. He forced himself to focus back on the journal. There was one entry that stood out, a series of diagrams and symbols unlike anything he'd seen before. They were intricate, almost geometric, but with an unsettling organic quality, like the patterns found on seashells or the veins of a leaf. Beneath the diagrams, a single word was written: Custodia, guardian. Suddenly, he remembered something his grandfather had said years ago, something about the lighthouse being built on an ancient site, a place of power. Could it be? Was the lighthouse not just a navigational aid, but something more? The fog seemed to press in on him, suffocating and disorienting. Back at the cottage, he grabbed a crowbar from the shed. The floorboards beneath the lighthouse were old, worn, and loose in places. He'd noticed one section in particular that seemed different. Tonight, he would find out why. The hum was almost deafening now, a constant thrumming that filled his head, distorting his thoughts. He could feel the deep song resonating within him, twisting his perceptions, blurring the line between reality and hallucination. He pried at the floorboards, the wood splintering and cracking under the force of the crowbar. It was a narrow shaft leading down into the unknown, a hidden chamber, a crypt. He hesitated for only a moment. Midpoint climax revelation ritual. The word echoed in Dean's mind, a discordant chime against the rational architecture he tried so hard to maintain. His grandfather, a cartographer like himself, a man who trusted only what he could measure and map, entangled in some arcane practice? Impossible. Yet the journal, the symbols etched into the cottage's very bones, screamed otherwise. The coordinates led him not to some forgotten corner of the island, but to the weather station, a squat, concrete building perched on the island's highest point. He'd dismissed it before, another relic of a bygone era, its instruments rusted, its purpose seemingly obsolete. Now it felt like the epicenter of something terrible. The door, surprisingly, wasn't locked. It groaned open, revealing a cramped room filled with decaying equipment. Dust motes danced in the faint light filtering through the grimy windows, illuminating cobwebs thick as shrouds. He found it exactly where the journal indicated, a loose floorboard beneath a rusted anemometer. Lifting it revealed a narrow wooden staircase leading down into darkness. The air emanating from the opening was cold, impossibly so, and carried the distinct odor of brine and decay. Hesitation clawed at him, a primal urge to turn back, to bury the journal and pretend he'd never seen any of it. But the need to know, the burning question of what his grandfather had been involved in, propelled him forward. He felt like he was being swallowed whole, the weight of the island pressing down on him. Finally, the stairs ended abruptly, opening into a small, circular chamber carved from the island's bedrock. The chamber was dimly lit by an unnatural, pulsating glow emanating from its center. There, resting on a crude stone altar, was something. It was difficult to describe, a geometric object of obsidian, its surface shifting and swirling with an oily, iridescent sheen. It pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, like a heart ripped from some ancient beast. The air around it shimmered, distorting the light and warping the very dimensions of the room. As Dean stared, transfixed, the object began to resonate, the pulsing growing stronger, faster. A low hum filled the chamber, vibrating in his chest, rattling his teeth. Then, the vision hit him. It wasn't a picture, not exactly. It was more like a flood of sensations, a torrent of images and emotions that overwhelmed his senses. He saw the island, not as it was now, but as it once had been, a place of lush vegetation and vibrant life. He saw people, ancient people, performing rituals on the beach, chanting to something in the sea. Then, the vision shifted. The island was consumed by a swirling vortex of water, the land dissolving into the sea. The people were gone, their screams swallowed by the waves. He saw the entity, a colossal form of writhing tentacles and gaping maws, rising from the depths, its eyes burning with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. And then, He saw himself. He was standing on the shore, his body contorted, his eyes vacant. He was a puppet, a vessel for the entity's will. He was leading others to the water's edge, offering them as sacrifices to the monstrous god. The vision ended abruptly, leaving him gasping for breath, his mind reeling. The chamber swam back into focus. The obsidian object pulsed with renewed intensity, the hum growing louder, more insistent. He understood now. It was real, and it was awakening. His grandfather hadn't been a madman. He'd been a guardian, desperately trying to contain something that should have remained buried. The ritual, the pact, the island. It was all connected. And now he was caught in the middle, the entity's gaze fixed upon him. The island wasn't just a refuge. It was a prison, and he was the jailer. But what could he do? How could he fight something so ancient, so powerful? Panic threatened to overwhelm him. He turned and fled, scrambling up the stairs. The image of his own vacant eyes burned into his mind. He burst out of the weather station, gasping for air, the fog pressing in on him like a suffocating blanket. The island felt different now, tainted, corrupted. He was no longer alone. He was being watched. Ritual. Impossible. Yet the journal, the symbols, the scratching. It returned, sharper now, more insistent from the walls. Not the wind, not rats. Something else. Dean pressed his palms against his ears, but the sound burrowed in, a frantic plea or a ravenous hunger. He couldn't tell which. Now. He grabbed the journal, shoving it into his coat pocket, the rough canvas scraping against his knuckles. He fumbled with the lock, his fingers clumsy, unresponsive. Panic clawed at his throat. He wrenched the door open and stumbled out into the storm. The lighthouse offered no solace, only amplified the dread. The beam, usually a reassuring sweep across the turbulent sea, now felt like a spotlight illuminating his terror. He needed information, something tangible to fight back. The weather station. It was a small concrete bunker a quarter-mile inland, perched on the highest point of the island. He remembered seeing it on one of his aimless walks, a relic of some forgotten research project. Maybe there were charts, instruments, anything that could offer a clue about the island's geology, its history, its secrets. The wind tore at him, a physical force trying to push his back. Rain lashed his face, blinding him. Each step was a battle. He kept his head down, focusing on the dim, intermittent glow of the lighthouse behind him, his only guide. He reached the weather station, a squat, featureless block against the raging sky. The door was rusted shut, but the lock was weak. A few blows with a rock, and it gave way with a screech of protesting metal. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The place had been abandoned for years. Instruments lay scattered, corroded and useless. Charts, brittle and faded, were pinned to the walls, depicting the island's topography, the surrounding sea currents. Nothing about rituals, nothing about ancient entities. Dean sank onto a rickety stool, defeated. He clutched the journal, his knuckles white. The diagrams, the symbols, they seemed to writhe before his eyes. He focused, forcing himself to decipher the spidery script. Most of it was gibberish, a chaotic mix of cartographic notations and arcane symbols. But then, a passage caught his eye. A diagram, a circle, bisected by a wave-like line. Underneath, a single word. Confinement. He scanned the surrounding text, his heart pounding. The words were fragmented, incomplete, but he pieced together the gist. A ritual, yes, but not of summoning, of binding, of sealing. But there was a condition. A sacrifice. The journal didn't specify what. The last few pages were torn, ripped away as if in a frenzy. The ritual was incomplete. What kind of sacrifice? And how could he possibly perform it, alone on this cursed island? The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It felt like claws scraping against the inside of his skull. He was running out of time. He looked around the weather station, his eyes darting from one object to another, searching for anything that could help him complete the ritual. The charts, the instruments, the rusted tools. Nothing seemed relevant. Then his gaze fell upon the radio. It was an old, clunky model, its dials corroded, its wires frayed. But maybe, just maybe, it still worked. If he could send a signal, reach out to the mainland, he could get help. But he knew, deep down, that help wouldn't arrive in time. The entity was too close. He had a choice to make. Attempt the incomplete ritual, with no idea what sacrifice it required, or try to escape, knowing that the entity would likely follow him, spreading its influence beyond the island. He looked at the journal, at the diagram of the circle, bisected by the wave. Confinement. The only word that offered a sliver of hope. But what could he possibly sacrifice? The scratching intensified. Give us what you lost. His breath hitched. His wife. It wanted his memories of her. His grief. His love. It wanted to consume the last vestiges of his humanity. He stumbled back, horrified. He couldn't. He wouldn't. But what choice did he have? Dean tasted bile. His wife. It wanted her. It wanted her. The entity's psychic assault slammed into him again, a tidal wave of despair and hunger. He fought to maintain his footing, both physically and mentally. It was more than just a storm. The island itself was reacting to the entity's growing power, twisting under its influence. He would stop it. He grabbed the grandfather's journal, its pages brittle and yellowed, and retreated to the small, cluttered kitchen. The air hung thick with the smell of salt and damp earth. He flipped through the final entries, his hands shaking. The counter-ritual. It was there, scrawled in his grandfather's increasingly erratic handwriting, a desperate plea against the darkness. The ritual required specific components, items steeped in the island's history and imbued with its fading natural power. He needed sea salt harvested from the island's northernmost point, a feather from a storm petrel nesting on the cliffs, and a stone from the ancient circle of monoliths near the weather station. The weather station. He'd avoided it since the technician's disappearance. A cold dread coiled in his stomach. Dean peered out the window. The storm raged with unnatural ferocity. Waves crashed against the rocks, sending plumes of spray high into the air. The wind tore at the trees, bending them double. Wait for a lull. He used the minutes to prepare. He gathered his oilskins, his boots, a sturdy length of rope, and a small bag for the ritual components. He checked his grandfather's old compass, its needle spinning wildly. He also took the hunting knife, its blade gleaming dully in the dim light. He didn't know what he would face, but he would be ready. He read the journal again, committing the counter-ritual to memory. The words were archaic, their meaning obscured by time and his grandfather's frantic scrawls, but he grasped the essence. A sacrifice of self, a channeling of grief and love into a force of protection. It would be a fight. A sudden stillness descended. The wind died down, the rain eased to a drizzle. It was a brief respite, a false calm before the storm's true fury. He knew it wouldn't last. He pulled on his oilskins and stepped out into the storm-ravaged landscape. The air was heavy with the smell of ozone and brine. The island felt different, tainted, as if the very ground beneath his feet was corrupted. The trees were twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. He made his way towards the cliffs, the wind picking up again, whipping at his face. The sea roared below, a churning mass of white foam and dark water. He found the storm petrel's nest, a precarious collection of twigs and seaweed clinging to the cliff face. As he turned towards the path to the weather station, he saw it. The monoliths. They were no longer standing upright, proud and defiant against the elements. They were leaning at unnatural angles, as if bowing to something unseen. And between them, shapes. Fear threatened to overwhelm him, but he pushed it down. He had come too far. He couldn't turn back now. He started towards the weather station, his steps slow and deliberate. The ground squelched beneath his boots. The shapes between the monoliths seemed to lengthen, to reach for him. It was waiting for him. He reached the door and hesitated. He knew what awaited him inside, but he also knew that the fate of the island, and perhaps his own sanity, rested on what he did next. He took a deep breath, gripped the hunting knife tightly in his hand, and pushed the door open. Dean tasted bile. His wife. It wanted her. It wanted her. The cottage seemed to groan around him, the wind howling like a banshee, clawing at the walls. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the table where the grandfather's journal lay open. Ignoring the screaming in his head, Dean grabbed the journal, shoving it into his jacket pocket. The ritual. It was his only chance. The front door bucked against his shoulder as he forced it open. A wall of rain and wind battered him. The storm had intensified tenfold. The island was no longer just being assaulted, it was being devoured. He pulled his oilskins tighter, the slick fabric offering little comfort against the raging elements. Visibility was near zero. The lighthouse was a ghost, a pale, flickering presence swallowed by the tempest. Dean set off, head bowed against the gale, each step a battle against the sucking mud and the relentless wind. It was close, too close. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Something moved in the periphery, a shifting darkness in the swirling rain. He couldn't make out a shape, but he felt the weight of its gaze, cold and hungry. He ran. He didn't stop until he reached the base of the lighthouse. He reached the lamp room, the massive lens casting an eerie, distorted glow. He fumbled for the journal, his hands shaking. But the entity was inside his head now, a cacophony of voices, a vortex of despair. He doubled over, clutching his head, trying to shut it out. A voice, not his own, rasped in his ear. "She will be ours." He screamed, a raw animal sound swallowed by the storm. He found the page, the faded ink barely visible in the dim light. He began to chant, his voice trembling at first, then growing stronger with each repetition. The ancient words, dredged from a forgotten tongue, resonated in the tower, vibrating in his bones. As he chanted, the storm outside intensified. The lighthouse shuddered, the beam faltering, flickering. Suddenly, the door to the lamp room burst open. Dean whirled around, heart hammering. Standing in the doorway was nothing. The entity had manifested. It lunged. Dean scrambled back, knocking over a toolbox. Tools clattered across the floor. He grabbed the first thing he could find, a heavy wrench, and swung it with all his might. The wrench connected with something solid, but it had little effect. The entity was not bound by the laws of physics. It was a force of nature, a primordial hunger given form. It swatted him aside like a fly. He crashed against the wall, his head hitting the stone. Pain exploded behind his eyes. He tasted blood. The entity loomed over him, its form shifting, coalescing into something vaguely humanoid, but impossibly wrong. Its eyes burned with an unholy light. "You cannot stop us," it hissed, its voice a chorus of screams. "This world will be ours." Dean struggled to his feet, ignoring the pain. It was the only way. But the entity was too fast. It grabbed him, its touch like ice. Then an idea, desperate, insane, clawed its way through the fog in his brain. He remembered the old weather station down the cliffside. Sacrifice. He broke free of the entity's grasp, stumbling toward the doorway. "No!" the entity roared, its voice filled with fury. Dean didn't look back. He plunged into the storm, heedless of the wind and the rain. Dean struggled to his feet, ignoring the pain blossoming in his ribs. It was the only way. He stumbled towards the center of the cottage's main room, towards the ancient symbols etched into the floorboards. Symbols that felt both alien and intimately familiar, like a half-remembered dream. But the entity was too fast. It grabbed him, its touch like the glacial waters he'd once fallen through as a boy. He felt his skin crawl, not just from the cold, but from the sheer wrongness of it. It wasn't flesh and blood. It was pressure, a crushing weight that threatened to collapse him from the inside out. He gasped, air seizing in his lungs. The room spun. The chanting voices, a chorus of the damned, intensified. The entity was trying to drag him under, into the black abyss from which it came. No, he wouldn't let it. Summoning a strength he didn't know he possessed, Dean clawed at the entity's grip. He yanked, pulling himself free for a precious second. He lurched forward, stumbling towards the final symbol. His hand trembled as he reached for the chalk, the dust clinging to his clammy skin. Now, with a guttural cry, Dean completed the final stroke. The chalk snapped. A blinding light erupted, searing itself onto the back of his eyelids. The chanting screeched to a halt, replaced by a high-pitched whine that resonated deep within his bones. The pressure vanished. He collapsed, gasping for air, his body trembling uncontrollably. The air hung thick with the smell of ozone and something else. Something ancient and briny, like the bottom of the ocean floor disturbed after centuries of undisturbed slumber. Slowly, cautiously, he pushed himself up. The cottage was still. The air was clear. The chanting was gone. Had it worked? Had he actually done it? He looked towards the center of the room. The symbols glowed faintly, pulsing with a soft, ethereal light. The circle was complete. The entity was gone. Or was it? A shiver ran down his spine. He could still feel it, a faint echo of its presence lingering in the air, like the phantom limb of a lost appendage. Merely contained. Dean stumbled outside. The storm had passed. The sky was a bruised purple, the first hint of dawn painting the horizon. The air was crisp and clean, washed clean by the storm. But the sea was different. It churned restlessly, even though the wind had died down. He walked towards the weather station, needing to confirm what he already knew. The door creaked open, revealing the instruments inside. The anemometer spun wildly, even in the still air. The barometer fluctuated erratically, but it was the seismograph that caught his attention. The needle danced violently, tracing a jagged, erratic line across the paper. An earthquake? But there was no tremor. The ground was still. No, not an earthquake. Something else. Dean became a recluse once more, but this time, his solitude was different. It was no longer a refuge from grief, but a vigil. He patrolled the coastline, searching for any sign of the entity's return. He studied the ancient texts, searching for a way to strengthen the barrier, to banish it forever. He visited the weather station every day, monitoring the instruments, watching for any sign of increased activity. The seismograph remained his constant companion, its erratic needle a constant reminder of the danger lurking beneath the waves. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood red, Dean stood on the cliffs overlooking the sea. The wind howled, whipping his hair around his face. The waves crashed against the rocks below, their roar a deafening symphony of power. He could feel it again. The presence. Stronger this time. Closer. He closed his eyes, listening to the deep song. It was no longer a distant murmur, but a clear, resonant call. It was calling to him, inviting him, promising him power, knowledge, oblivion. He opened his eyes, and in the center of the vortex something was rising. A shape, a form, ancient and terrible. He had to stay. He had to fight. if he could truly contain the entity forever, or if, eventually, he too would be swallowed by the deep song. The entity rose higher, its form becoming clearer.